Okay, we are live. On Sunday, August 8th, 1982, Nancy Galvani told her friends she had to pick up her daughter from the home she used to share with her husband, her strange husband, Patrick. Patrick had moved the pickup date a day earlier from Monday to Sunday. Nancy never returned. Her yellow Buick was found in her estranged husband's garage. The clothes that Nancy was last seen in were also found in her estranged husband's possession. Nancy's body was recovered the next day in the San Francisco Bay. She had been strangled and was unclothed except for underwear. Her body was bound and stuffed in a sleeping bag with rope weighted down by a cinder block. Patrick Galvani, Nancy Galvani's estranged husband, was arrested and charged with murder, but not long after, the charges were dropped by the late DA of San Mateo County, Attorney Keith Sorensen, who remarked as he was dropping the charges, quote, "I'm not saying for a minute Mr. Galvani is innocent or didn't do it," unquote. My guest, Alison Galvani, is an epidemiologist and a professor of epidemiology. Excuse me, I'm getting it tongue-tied, at the Yale School of Public Health, and she has more accolades and awards than I have time for in this introduction. She has tirelessly pursued justice for her mother, Nancy, for decades. Welcome, Alison Galvani.
Well, thank you so much, Roberta. I've admired you for such a long time, and I'm really grateful for you bringing attention to my mother's case.
Well, I'm grateful for you being here. So I always feel like a little bit of a fraud writing a title, Justice for Nancy, or Justice. I mean, justice is really getting the victim back, and that's not possible. As a victim's daughter, what's your concept of justice?
I think that justice is the thorough investigation and prosecution of those responsible for her death, my father. But secondary, if that can't be achieved, is to at least expose the truth and bring awareness to her case, which is what you're doing. So I feel like you are helping me to achieve justice one way or another.
So why did they drop the case?
I can only really speculate on that, but my father's lawyers argued that I was his alibi and that this violent crime couldn't have occurred without me hearing it in the San Francisco apartment that he lived in, where she was going to pick me up. But the police didn't realize, and the prosecutor didn't realize, that my father had arranged for me to be elsewhere that night with his uncle, who also shares the same name, Pat. And so the police and prosecutor were confused on the accuracy of his alibi defense.
And your father also armed himself with quite a formidable lawyer named John Kecker, who claimed your father passed a lie detector test. Did your father pass a lie detector test? Is that true?
It certainly wasn't a lie detector test administered by the authorities. My aunt, who is also a lawyer who worked on my father's defense, she's told me that a number of times, so that's where my information is coming from. But apparently it was a lie detector test arranged by John Kecker, and they privately paid for it. And I even heard from my aunt's husband that they went out of state for it as well. But yeah, he definitely, I had understood that, or I had assumed that it was a lie detector test administered by the police when my aunt would tell me that over the years, but it wasn't. The police said, no, he didn't. He wouldn't talk to us after we came to the apartment.
That's so interesting because these lie detector tests are so used in that way. They get these friendly lie detector tests. There's a Scottish case, killer Luke Mitchell, Jody Jones's killer, who's convicted, and they got him imprisoned through this very friendly and also had, lie detector, and his supporters will show this. They'll say, oh, but he passed a lie detector. It's so convincing is my point. Woody Allen, same thing, got the very similar thing. But when they fail a lie detector test by the authorities, they say, well, they're not reliable. They're either incredibly reliable, depending on the result and who you're supporting, or not reliable at all. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And
it's such an interesting detail he fished out. Like, well, he passed a lie detector test, and the public's like, but they don't think further as to how it was done or who did it or what the circumstances were. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I think the circumstances are crucial because, for all I know, they could have gone to multiple, because they're doing it privately and they don't have to release that information. I mean, my father's attorneys, for all I know, maybe he did a number of times before he passed. If he was so confident about it, well, why didn't he talk to the police or take one with the police?
Wait, did he cooperate with the authorities, or was he?
No, not at all.
So, yeah, you don't know what was asked. He could have been asked, anything. You don't know the questions were asked, or you don't know the veracity of the quality of the person who's doing it. But people get fooled by these things all the time. I'm just asking my audience to think smarter and ask the next question beyond how was it done, who did it, what were asked. Well, can we see it? You know what I mean? Can we see the results? You know what I mean? These things are just so easily accepted and kind of like, and clung on to by the true crime community.
Agree. And if you're the type of person, which my father is, that you think you can outsmart everyone, then you wouldn't be as nervous, which is what the lie detector is picking up: anxiety, like increased heartbeat, that sort of thing. And he would have known that and been able potentially to tell himself, well, just as long as I don't show anxiety, and he's going to feel less anxiety if he thinks, well, I can outsmart them.
Right. There's also another way where you race your heartbeat on the control questions, and there's all sorts of different things. Or to try to fool a lie detector test. Especially your dad seems to be very, very intelligent man. So what was your impression of this John Kecker? And did you have, as a child, did you have any interaction with him? And what's your impression of him now?
I had no direct interactions with him. so I can't really speak to that, but he's very high profile lawyer, and he's also very politically connected in the Bay Area. Very expensive, like celebrity lawyer. And I do think that prosecutors can be intimidated by that. And like he donated to, just as an example, Gascon's political campaign as like a defense attorney donating to the DA. So yeah, that gives him additional leverage with prosecutors.
So I was just showing Alison, I'll just show my audience for those watching on YouTube. He just won an award, John Kecker, in 2022. Just to give you an idea of the gravitas of what we're talking about here. This is the Bill Edlund Award for Professionalism in the Law 2022 award ceremony honoring John W. Kecker. And here he is, sort of, you can just get a sense of him. I got a sense of him from his comments, from his quotes. Not a good one.
As a federal public defender, I thought I would never win a case. My first case, just as an exemplar, was, and I see Bill Osterhout back there, he's had these experiences too. My first case was for a guy named Spencer Goodloe, who was a 20-year-old. He'd already been in state prison.
So anyway, that'll give you just an idea of who we're talking about. But that's so interesting that he gave to George Gascon. Did I share that? Did you see that clip? Was I sharing that?
Oh, yeah, you were. Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes I have a habit of like not sharing it, thinking I'm sharing when I'm not. Just an idea of who he is. So who is George Gascon, and why'd you bring him up?
So George Gascon, he was previously the DA in San Francisco. And, after I essentially realized my father was guilty, I contacted, or I had representation who contacted him, and they put together a binder of evidence, and asked if he would meet with me, and yeah, he was not willing to even meet with me.
Wow, but he met with the Menendez family.
Yeah.
This is a DA that actually, you know what? I'll play the clip one more time.
Then he went to LA. Yeah.
So this is when he got to LA, he became notorious. He got rid of the department that notified victims when their loved one's killer came up for parole, the entire department, to keep them out of parole hearings because victims' voices are so powerful. He did everything to skew the system. So what he did was he put in all these defense attorneys as district attorney, and he armed with almost what he says is almost $50 million of Open Society Foundation money. I always have this clip on the ready because when you say Soros prosecutors, people get, like my boyfriend, get very up in arms about it. They think it's been, people have denied it and say it's a conspiracy theory, but here's George Gascon saying that he put in defense attorneys with the Open Society Foundation money through the ACLU and had all these defense attorneys run as district attorney. So when they got in, they wouldn't prosecute people. And not only would they not prosecute people, but they would get rid of things like gun enhancements. So if you do a crime with a gun, you get more time, and basically be another arm of the defense. So there's no prosecutor. It's like having two defense attorneys talking to themselves in court. This is how Adnan Syed, Heyman Lee's killer, got out in Baltimore with Marilyn Mosby, was one of these prosecutors, Soros prosecutors, or Open Society Foundation money prosecutors. Here he is, very briefly. Wouldn't even meet with Alison. He's openly hostile to victims' family members, take a
We
listen.
literally started looking at the map of the U.S. and we were trying to identify strategically what are the urban centers where anybody that could be considered a progressive prosecutor. There were a couple of people that have been nibbling in some areas, but we just couldn't find one. So one of the conversations was then, how do we go about creating a movement here, which actually eventually led to Open Societies Foundation, which is a George Soros Foundation, putting almost $50 million in 2014 through the ACLU to begin the movement. And people like Larry Krasner and others came to my office while they were running for office. In some cases, we identified people to run for office, and then many would come in after getting elected. They send their people in. So, like for instance, Larry's number 2. At one point, spent almost a month going in and out of my office.
So that's Larry Krasner, the DA of Philadelphia. He's talking about there at the end.
Yeah,
So,
that's fine if you're a public defender, but as the DA, your mission should be to work on behalf of victims. So it is like putting, and maybe that's even your icon, putting a wolf in sheep's clothing.
that is my icon. And it's also, I've said it's like saying we're all going to play on the same basketball team and we're going to win so, we'll all wear the same uniforms and get the ball in the same basket and we'll win every time. We're sick of losing. The movement was sick of losing. So they basically, cheated. I mean, the prosecutor is supposed to represent the people and the victim and the victim's family. That's what they do. And instead, their interest is entirely with the defendants and the accused. So there's no one there representing the victim's interest and no one representing the people's interest. And he purposely silenced victims' family members by keeping them out, by just, if we get rid of the department that notifies victims' family members, then they'll never know when the parole hearing is. And we'll keep them out of parole hearings. So their voice will never be heard, which is, it's already a challenge anyway. So You were 5 years old and your father was arrested. What were you told at the time? And what did you feel about, what were you told what happened to your mother? And
well, at first, so my father, when my mother hadn't come to pick me up, when I was expecting her to come, as you explained, he had changed the time to Sunday night. And but Monday morning, which was the agreed upon time, that's when I was expecting her to pick me up. And when she didn't come, my father said that, it was stressful for her going through his divorce and, having you. So she probably just ran off. And that was the narrative before her body was found. And you see, I think that was what he was planning. He, as you described, he weighted her body down with a cinder block and, dumped her body in the bay and wasn't expecting it to be found, although it was found the next day. Because the cinder block wasn't sufficient. It was found by fishermen. And I did see him in handcuffs being arrested, and I asked my grandmother why he was in handcuffs, and she said, they always put, because they deal with dangerous people, they always put people in handcuffs. But as a 5-year-old, I didn't realize he had been arrested. And he was out, he got out on bail. So he was away when he was arrested. He was away for a few days. And then when he came back home, I didn't know, because I hadn't known he was out on or even what the concept of bail was. I found out later he was out on bail.
Mm-hmm.
And then in December, the charges were dropped. And you read the article that it doesn't sound much like vindication with the prosecutor saying, I'm not saying for a minute that he's not guilty.
No, I made sure that quote got in there. I'm not saying that he's innocent at all, or and to me they said it's just a circumstantial case, but those are some of the most tightest cases, most overwhelming cases to me. If I were a juror, I was just telling you before we went on, if I were a juror and I got this case, there's some really key elements in here: the car, the clothes, seen nowhere else. And certainly moving you around is an added detail. To me, it doesn't sound like a circumstantial case. But what did you believe for years about your mother's? Did you internalize that? And do you believe that you were the cause of your mother's murder? Or what did you think had happened to her?
Well, when, my mother's body was, so that's just what he was telling me the days before her body was found or identified, like her body was found the next day, but I didn't know that until the police came to our house. I think it was like 6 days later. And so I knew she hadn't abandoned me. And I really wasn't, he was trying to push that narrative, but I also did feel like she wouldn't abandon me. And then, my father, and this is actually something that his attorneys did, they went about victim blaming, like saying, and so I did believe this for a long time when I was a kid, and even into adulthood, that a serial killer who's killing sex workers, well, he didn't use the word sex workers, whores, like whores probably killed her, or a drug dealer killed her. And and that because she was
your mother's mental health too. Can you talk about that again?
So which I do think is irrelevant, because it's clear she did. If it would be relevant if it possibly could have been a suicide, but she clearly didn't kill herself. And but they they said, she's paranoid and she's bipolar, and she had been diagnosed just a few months prior. And she was telling people, Pat's trying to kill me. And so they said, she's paranoid. Yeah, well, it's not paranoid if it actually happens to you. But I think she was under tremendous stress. Well, I know she was, because of the physical abuse. And so I think that whether or not she was actually bipolar or was just driven to extreme depression and anxiety during that time, it does seem actually irrelevant. But you're right, he would victim blame, she was crazy and she was a whore, taking drugs.
Seems like my impression was that your father pushed her to that state and then used it.
Yeah,
that was my impression. I was very suspicious of that diagnosis. It was sure useful for your dad. And so how did your feelings towards your father's culpability change? And how did the family split around this? I mean, this issue? Who supported your father and who did anyone turn their back?
Everyone in his immediate family supported him. So his mother, his sisters, one was a lawyer who worked on his defense even. But I know that some other family members, more distantly, I know at this point that some were suspicious or just right out thought he was guilty. But his immediate family, they care a lot about the reputation and family name. So even if they thought he was guilty, they just existed in denial and wanting to protect their reputation, not be embarrassed by him being a murderer.
Right. Yeah, I see that almost 100% of the time in these cases. The family goes lock stop behind the killer, and the few family members that say no get ostracized, or there's real rifts in the family because of it. The usual thing to do is to go behind the killer because of the shame of it.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I felt shame even as a kid, just before I realized my father was guilty, just shame and that my mother had been murdered, because, especially when you're a kid and when you're first meeting someone, they ask you, or they talk about parents. And then, you have to say, oh, that your mother's dead. And that is already surprising enough to people. And then when they ask, I mean, I would try to steer conversations as far away from the topic as possible, but, it just happened repeatedly, of course, that people would then ask like how she died. And, I had to say she was murdered. And I just felt shame around that, even before realizing that my father was guilty.
And what happens after you say my mother was murdered? Dead silence, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, people are just
uncomfortable silence.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it's such a heavy thing to begin, because it would come up in conversations when you're first getting to know someone, or, asking about your parents. And so it's such a heavy thing to plop down at the beginning of getting to know someone.
Right. Like I was interviewed one time, someone I wanted to interview, and she gave me like a full interview. Like, do you have kids? I've never felt more on the spot and ill-equipped. And so I can't even imagine, when there's such stress in this society to say, the idea is that you're from a good family, from a good home and a good family, and murder is, I think there's a stigma there, don't you think, that you're not from a good home if there's some kind of murder?
Yeah, I mean,
somehow they take the brunt.
Yeah, I felt that stigma. And also because my father was victim, because some people ask, well, who did it? And I would usually just say I didn't know. But, because he was saying that my mother was murdered because she was a whore, druggie, living in she had taken me to a woman's shelter, and, all these, and, yeah, she was crazy. So when someone would ask me how she died, like, I would also just feel shame and stigma around all of that.
Yeah, of course. And then, your father, strangely, is getting away from can you talk about his history of he's putting, totally talk about Darvo, deny attack, reverse victim offender. He had a, certainly put your mom and then you through a lot of violence. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and there's one incident that I think is particularly pertinent, that because she was killed through asphyxiation. There was one time I heard particularly vicious fighting. I mean, they fought a lot. The neighbors said that. And when I ran into my parents' bedroom, and my mother, had been pushed back on the bed, and my father was straddling her. They were fully clothed. My father was straddling her, pinning down her arms, like with his knees, and he was pushing a big pillow over her face. And I was begging him to stop. And then he would occasionally lift the pillow. And at those times, my mother would say, listen to your daughter, listen to your daughter. And he did. I mean, he did stop eventually, but she told people apparently that she viewed that as an attempted murder itself. If you have the quote so my father admits to this, and he justifies it as, oh, I was trying to quiet her for the neighbors. And there's even a quote in one of the articles, because she had cited this in a restraining order against him, and he responded saying he was trying to deaden the noise. Deaden was the word he used, for the neighbors. And so he put a pillow over her face, and then he said that she conked out.
Wow, it's almost like he's telling exactly what he did to your mom there. He's deadening.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like a. I mean, if you believe in statement analysis, I mean, the words that he chose, conked out, deadened the noise. I mean, those, we pick words, we choose our words we have a whole host of words to describe something, and the ones we choose are really, I think, important. But so seldom do people listen. Wow. Well, that's a really insightful point. Gives you almost chills. And the fact that his sister worked on his defense, what do you think? I mean, just on the surface, like, what do you say? Bad fact, clothes found in his possession, car found. I mean, how do you, I don't even understand where the denial, how you can even deny something like that to yourself when something's so clearly in front of you. But
yeah, I think, especially the aunt that worked on the case, she did flip. And I know from talking to her former husband, I was married to her at the time, it sounded like flipped in and out of denial. Like, because she was practicing in New York City, but she had flown to San Francisco and was staying with us to work on his case. And she would call her husband every night, and apparently she'd say, one night she'd say, oh my God, he's guilty, I don't know what we're going to do. And then the next night be saying, oh, no, there's no way he could have done it. And I know that although she's never expressed reservations to me about his guilt, one of her kids told, my cousin, told me that she said that was the worst experience of her life. And who knows if he's even innocent. But she's the aunt that she's the only person who hasn't ostracized me in that immediate family.
isn't that interesting? So she knows. You think she knows, huh?
I think she knows, but I also do know the power, because I essentially experienced it myself, of denial and cognitive dissonance. Like, I don't want to think my father is guilty of murder, but I know he is from the evidence.
Rosemary Romero, thank you, Roberta, for helping Alison and bringing awareness for justice for Nancy. There is a email address linked to the top of the chat where you can write the DA and tell the DA Maya to reopen this case. So please use it. And that goes to my next question, which is...
Rosemary has been a wonderful supporter, and I'm so grateful to her. So yeah, thank you, Rosemary, for your generosity to Roberta.
Appreciate it. So what do you think the rights of victims, the public perception of the rights of victims' family members are versus the actual reality?
Well, the fact that Gascon wouldn't meet with me, I think, says a lot. So yeah, I think at least he didn't care about victims. And I don't know the original prosecutor, what the story was with him, like why he dropped it. But he's the one that gave the quote. I'm not saying for a minute that he's not guilty. But I think they didn't, especially maybe at the time in 1982, they were trying to dehumanize her so that people would care less about her, by calling her a whore and a druggie. And she was a social worker who, she had a master's in social work, and she, I think she was far from a whore and a druggie. But even more recently, I mean, still 10 years ago, but, since being an adult myself, he, on a police recorded phone call that the police had arranged for me to talk to him, he said her dying is the best thing that ever could have happened to you. You would be a druggie if she hadn't died.
Well, where is his line of thinking with that? Because being around her, she would have brought you around terrible things. Like, because the hotel, they make a lot of points that the hotel that she was staying at, is that the women's hostel or the women's shelter? Or is that just...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, so when she left him, we did go to a women's shelter. We were there for a few weeks, and then she moved into like a residential hotel that, they make a big deal that it was in the Tenderloin. Like just as though that explains everything.
Right. Like they didn't drive you. Well, like that someone in the Tenderloin's going to drive her car to your dad's garage and put it in there. I mean,
exactly. Like a serial killer that he says is killing prostitutes in the Tenderloin area. Well, how does he then know where to bring her car to? He said he was framed. The car being brought back to his house in his garage was framing him.
Mm-hmm. And, we just have this idea that there's like the big government, big prosecution up against the little guy. And we have these endless shows and TV shows on the innocent person wrongfully accused. But we have very little media from the victim's family perspective or even the victim's perspective. I mean, aren't they? I mean, to my eye, they're the little guy. I mean,
I think by definition they are. Yeah.
The little guy up against right. I don't know how this has gotten so reversed. And you have your own channel called My Father's Alibi, and you run in the true crime genre. What is your outlook on the genre and these campaigns like the Free Karen Reed campaign, etc., or these kind of?
So I think my interest in true crime. I'm still trying to understand the psychology of criminals like my father, the level of narcissism that it takes. So I think that's why I'm fascinated by true crime. In terms of these innocence campaigns, with Karen Reed, I think the most disturbing aspect for me is that her supporters have been attacking the family, like John O'Keefe's family. Like, there's absolutely no question that even if she is innocent, the family are still victims. Like, I don't see how anyone can feel justified in treating the family badly.
That's a really good point. And that if you go back to my first episodes when I'm just kind of learning the case publicly, that was the thing that really bothered me. Is I said, well, if she is innocent, why isn't she calling off the dogs to her supporters and to Turtle Boy and saying, hey, stop harassing the witnesses in this case and stop harassing the victim's family? But she never has, because, of course, I learned later that she spearheaded it, but you don't know that in the beginning. I mean, that's your first clue, that I don't know any innocent person who would act like that, you know? It's odd. And I mean, you know, you talk about trying to understand the mindset of your father. What are the limitations? I mean, do you think that we're ever really able to understand the mindset of a killer, really?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think for people with empathy, so that is I mean, like, it's on a spectrum, but you know, that's the vast majority of the population. To try to get into the mind of someone who lacks empathy is really almost impossible, but I still find myself trying to do that. You know, or trying to understand, like, well, why did he do such a stupid thing as bringing the car back to his house? He could have dumped it somewhere else. Yeah, so trying to get into the mind of some of this kind of stupidity of these killers, but then, you know, particularly their, you know, I think that's part of a narcissism too, is they think they're going to get away with it because they think they're so much smarter than everyone else. And
Right.
I found myself asking, like, how did this person think they would get away from? Of course, you know what? My father has gotten away with it.
There he did. He thinks it, and people say to me all the time about Karen Reed, like, well, you're going to be so shocked when she gets away with it. Like, when she gets acquitted, I'll be the first person to say she may get acquitted. Turtle Boy too. I'm not saying that these people are going to get off. It happens all the time. That's not my point. That's not my cause. I'm pointing out just something much larger, which is this innocence fraud, the power of it, and how, and you know, how many people supported your mother? How many people supported your father? Really, you know, exactly. I mean, really, in the grand scheme of things, it just seems like these killers have such power in their, you know, not just through their lawyers, and it's really the lawyers that are doing the majority of this stuff.
Yeah, so my mother was like an only child, and her father had died when she was in college. And so she only had her mother to advocate for her, and her mother was, I think, intimidated by Pat's family, my father's family. And yeah, in turn, his family was desperate to protect their reputations, the reputation of the family. So he had a lot of people and a lot of expertise and a lot of money behind him, where she had essentially nobody advocating for her until, like, you know, 40 years later, I had to sort of grow up and realize how guilty he was. And then, you know, that's what I'm attempting to do now, is to advocate that her case deserves proper attention.
Right. And, you know, I think, you know, you've also had experience with John Lewin. I remember interviewing John Lewin, and he's known as king of the cold cases. He's a district attorney in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And he said, what I love about cold cases is that no matter when you do it, eventually it's this really just idea that no matter how long you get away with it, eventually everyone has to pay the piper. It would be great if that always happened. Not always. There's people who have to pay the piper and get acquitted. There's people who get acquitted and then turn it around and become the victim, like Amanda Knox, make themselves the victim. obscure the real victim totally. So, I mean, there's a lot of scenarios. You had some interaction with John Lewin. What was that like?
I have profound admiration for John Lewin. I can't think of any prosecutor that I admire as much as him. He is brilliant and so passionate about these cases and fighting for victims that have been denied justice by the definition of them being cold cases, and taking on challenging cases that other prosecutors might not touch, but where there's a lot of strong circumstantial evidence. His meticulous preparation, ability to connect with jurors, is extraordinary.
Yeah, it was crazy today in the ASAP Rocky case. He's just like the number 2 in that case. It's not one of his, I don't think this is his, he brings his passion to everything he does, but he was thrown on this case at the last minute. This isn't one of his cold cases, so it's a little bit different. But he was reprimanded by ASAP Rocky's lawyer for going up to ASAP Rocky's family, his mother and sister, and saying, this isn't personal that we're prosecuting your son and your brother. I have a son myself. I know this must be hard for you. And please consider having him take this sweetheart plea deal that they offered him. And they were saying how awful and inappropriate and how dare you talk to the defendant's family in court. And the judge was like, this is totally proper. What are you talking about? There's no rule against that. So it was interesting that they were so offended. But these lawyers, and the other thing about being a voice for a murder victim is that they're asking, like, your grandmother was asked to be her strongest and face an army of people when she's in intense grieving and shock. And that's the other element of it that these, I think, defense lawyers capitalize, that they so seldom can do the things that are unfortunately really needed, like being a PR advocate for yourself and getting interviews and getting attention on the case, et cetera, et cetera. How important do you think the press is in getting a case prosecuted?
I think the press can be important because it can put pressure on the authorities to, if nothing else, out of embarrassment, that if they have a strong case, then they should be going forward with it. So I think, press can be powerful. I mean, the press, of course, it can be manipulated too, and it's not like it's a monolith. So you have some people in the media wanting to push one narrative, and unfortunately, some of these conspiracy theories tend to draw way more attention than they should because they're intriguing. So I do think it's complicated, but what you do in bringing awareness to cases, I think can be crucial to justice. And if nothing else, you're exposing the truth. As I said, that's what I see is the if my mother doesn't get justice with a prosecution, at least it's second best to me that awareness is brought to her case.
Right. It's been my pleasure talking to you, Alison. We'll have to have you back on again, or you're welcome on anytime you like. Anytime you want to come back, please just send me a line. We have a question. Does Patrick Did he date or remarry after your mother's murder?
No.
That's interesting. Tammie asks, sorry, hold on, Tammie. Does Alison have a timeline written from her hand? Did you write a timeline from?
Yes, there is a timeline. Is Tammie asking if yeah, I put together a timeline, if that's the question.
Okay. How Alison was 5 when she found out. Oh, how old were you when you? I think what Kristen's asking is, how old were you when you believed your dad murdered your mom? Is that what you're asking, or how old was she when she found out her dad murdered your mom?
I think probably means when I realized. So I had, these memories kind of encapsulated of being sent to Uncle Pat's house and how odd that was, and how my father canceled picking me up, and I had suppressed. I mean, it's not a recovered memory. I always remembered that, but I didn't ask him about it every once in a while. He'd say like, "Oh, my car broke down," or I drank and then I couldn't drink and drive, and so that's why I couldn't pick you up that night. And so, and cognitive dissonance is psychologically powerful, and not wanting to think he was guilty and being very attached to him, like he was the only thing I had left after she was. I don't have any siblings or I think I suppressed everything psychologically as much as I could and compartmentalized it until I had my own child. And that kind of, then I had renewed grief that made me think more and more about the facts, and how odd everything was. And then I started reaching out to family members and, getting as much information as possible. And I couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence against him. But I was in my 30s.
Where does Patrick live?
Oh, he lives in San Francisco.
Wesley John Holmes asks, when was the last time Alison ended any interaction with your father?
The last time was a police recorded phone call which was more than 10 years ago at this point, and followed by an email from him, which I didn't reply to.
Tammie asks, do you have any siblings?
No.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very common, when, I was looking at the picture in the LA Times LA Times interview with you, Alison, and you have your own child there, and it looks, just the hair alone looks so much like you as the young picture. You can see it in the thumbnail with your mom. It looks so much like you, that light hair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can imagine that basically triggering, and of course you want your own mom close when you have children. So yeah, it's very common. Makes sense. Is your husband supportive?
Oh yeah, he's very supportive. Yeah, and he thinks my father is guilty.
You know what I was thinking about, Alison, is whether, because you were 5, I thought a lot about Elizabeth Loftus and how you can't trust your memories, and were your memories corrupted, and wondered if you were going to go through. Are you familiar with her? She's a memory expert.
I'm very familiar with her from
a lot of defense.
Yeah, from the Robert Durst, and seeing John Lewin very effectively undermine her credibility, which deserved to be undermined because yeah, she's compared herself to saving. She's compared herself to Schindler, like saving these, including
Yes.
like Ted Bundy. Like she was on the side of Ted Bundy, Harvey Weinstein, Robert Durst.
Tim Hennis. Tim
Yeah,
Hennis, she
Tim
still won't
Hennis.
admit is guilty. Got him
Yeah,
out and then went around all these Innocence Project conferences, and then his DNA was found inside Susie Eastburn, the victim. And I mean, it was
and she still
tested, but
won't.
DNA came around, and now he's militarily on death row. They had to try him militarily, and she still won't admit he's guilty.
Yeah, exactly. She still won't admit
And
he's
Kate's
guilty.
books to him. Yeah, did you worry about coming across, someone like that? Like, someone who would try to debunk you with some of these kinds of very academic, I don't know, academic kind of ideas that memory is totally, totally not reliable at all in any way, I guess would be. We all get that it's elastic and it's not like a tape recorder, which is her famous saying. Nobody says it is like a tape recorder. But are you worried about that at all?
Well, just a couple things about that. So there's, I think, more scientific evidence that, in contrast to what she's saying, that when a person experiences trauma, they release hormones that then have an effect on encapsulating that memory. So for instance, even if it was many years ago, if you ask someone where they were on 9/11, they can probably tell you. But if you ask them where they were like a week before the 9/11 event, they have no idea. So there's that aspect. But then also, and yeah, of course, like, I'm sure that's what my father's defense would attempt to do in a trial. But the Foster City Police, they interviewed me again then, as an adult, and there were things that I was able to confirm that demonstrated how accurate my memory was as a 5-year-old. So yeah, it was consistent. Just for instance, like I was able to describe the sleeping bag that had been in the trunk of her car, which it ends up her body was found in. And I haven't seen that since I was 5, and the police still have that. And this is just an example that I think it's been verified that my memory around those events is very accurate.
All right, I'm gonna end it here. Actually, someone asked you, is there DNA? Angela asks.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, Tammie asks, how old were you before you could feel safe or some sort of safe?
Well, I think I might still have a problem feeling as safe as like the average person. I'm a very anxious person and risk averse. Everyone worries about their kids, but I think I worry excessively. So in that sense, I don't know if I feel as safe as a lot of people do, but I do certainly feel a lot safer. As time goes by, I think I feel, more and more safe.
Thank you so much, Alison, for doing this. And you always have a place on this channel anytime you want to come back.
Oh, thank you so much, Roberta. I really appreciate you bringing awareness to my mother's case.
Thank you. And please write the DA. Just send a quick email and tell them to reinvestigate and reopen Nancy Galvani's case. It doesn't have to be long. Please hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. Have a great night, everybody. I'll see you back tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern.